If you've seen my videos, you'll know I like working with wild clay pottery in my projects. Not only is clay an incredibly versatile and resourceful substance, useful for a surprising range of applications, but I found working with the earth beneath our feet creates a strong connection between the maker, their material, and their environment. That said, there can be challenges in working this way, and some wild clay deposits, like what I have here near my workshop, are too soft and fragile on their own to be reliably made into pottery. Many will work fine on their own, but it can be a bit of a lottery with what you find. A little over a year ago, I made a video about the Islamic alchemist Al-Razi and his recipe for making the clay he used to build his alchemical equipment, which he describes in his Book of Secrets, the Kitab al-Asrar, which I have here, is translated to English by Dr. Gail Marlowe Taylor from earlier German translations of the original Islamic work, which dates from somewhere between 700 to 800 AD. In that video, I showed that by reproducing that more than 1,000-year-old alchemist's recipe, I had managed to turn the fragile clay from the soil outside my workshop into a much more workable and reliable clay body. The success I've had with this recipe has been repeatable and consistent, and over the past year, I have experimented with and modified the alchemist's recipe into a more simplified modern version, which I now use every time I make clay with this soil. And in this video, I'd like to just quickly share my updated personal process for making my alchemist's clay from start to finish. The first step, as always, is just to dig up clay. If you've seen my earlier video on the subject, this will be familiar. Clay minerals are diverse, but are largely recognizable due to their unique affinity for water. When dry, they'll appear almost like a brittle cement. When damp, they'll be moldable and plastic, forming smooth clods when dug up. These properties come from the fact that at the molecular level, clay adheres to water much more than sand or silt can. Clay minerals can hydrate, which means they can actually form hydrogen bonds with water, allowing the clay to stick to water in a similar way to how water sticks to itself. The clay can use these weak hydrogen bonds to adhere clay particles together, using water as a bridge, almost like glue, making it plastic and moldable, unlike sand or silt. Once I've collected my clay, I can exploit this hydration property to dissolve the clay into water. This isn't true dissolution, but is instead a suspension of clay particles in water, and over time, the clay will begin to settle. Luckily for us, however, it will settle much slower than sand and silt, so to separate it from those impurities, I'll just wait for the sand and silt to settle, but not the clay, which will typically take 5 to 15 minutes. And then, I'll just decant the suspension through a strainer into another bucket. The strainer will catch all the roots and leaves and buoyant contaminants, and will leave me with a nice suspension of refined clay. I'll just let this settle until the water's clear on top, and then I'll decant that clear water back into the first bucket to start the process over again. If it takes a really long time for your clay to separate, add more water. If it all separates very quickly, try using a little less water. I just repeat this decantation process back and forth until a thicker and thicker layer of purified clay builds up in the bottom of the second bucket, and a cleaner and cleaner pile of sand and silt is left behind in the first bucket. Once I have a decent amount collected, I'll just pour the refined clay out to dry. I use some old baking sheets for this, but basically any container would work, and you could even just let it dry in the bucket. If your clay source is suitable, you can start working with this clay as soon as it dries to the right consistency. However, because I already know my clay needs the alchemical treatment, I'm going to let it dry all the way till it turns into crackled shards of dry clay, just as Al-Razi specifies. Next, I'm going to grind these chunks into a powder. I've tried multiple different methods, but what I've settled on as the best way to grind up clay is this giant mortar and pestle I made out of wood, which was a surprisingly easy sort of quick and dirty build, which I can make a short video on if anyone's interested. Remember, whenever grinding powders, sanding, or really working with fine powders in general, it's crucial to wear an adequate mask or respirator to protect your lungs. After grinding the powder, sieving it, grinding some more, and sieving again, I'm left with a nice fine clay powder. Potters typically call this powder dry process. I think this powdered state is pretty much the best way to stir clay long term, and I like to keep bags of this stuff on hand for over the winter, when it's harder to dig and process clay due to both the ground and my decantation buckets constantly freezing over. Because I want to fire my pottery in my open pit kiln, which is basically just a campfire in a hole, I'm going to need to temper my clay. Because clay expands and contracts a lot when it's heated and cooled, it can sometimes explode or crack when thrown on a fire. But if you add enough of a substance that doesn't expand or contract as much, like sand, or in this case, charcoal dust, to your clay powder, you can prevent this from happening, and do all sorts of horrible and torturous things to your pottery without it cracking. How much temper you use will depend on your clay, and what application you're making the pot for. Because I intend for the objects I'm making here to be routinely heated to a relatively extreme temperature in my experiments, I'm going to use around 25% temper by volume, or around a cup of temper for each 3 cups of clay dust. That said, most clays will fire fine in a campfire with much less, and I've opened fire pottery to terracotta successfully with as low as 10% temper. If people would like it, I'll make a video specifically about open firing pottery. But for the time being, I'll link to a video on Andy Word's Ancient Pottery channel in the description below, as he's far more experienced with the process than I am, and is probably the best source for information on wild clay, hand-building pottery, and open firing on YouTube. With my clay and temper sorted, it's finally time for the alchemy, and it really couldn't be simpler. I'm just going to add a couple spoonfuls of regular white flour to water, and bring it to a boil, making a sort of thickened sauce. Through experiment, I believe I've more or less confirmed my theory about Al-Razi's recipe, where he uses rice flour and water rice has been cooked in, along with other ingredients, to enhance his clay. I believe it's the starches in rice and flour, which are chains of sugars, that are the key to this recipe, and by boiling any starchy matter, be it from rice, kern, wheat, or even potatoes, you can expand those chains and tangle the molecules together in a process called starch gelatinization, creating a sort of sticky thick starch gel. I found 1 spoonful of flour is enough for 2 to 3 cups of my dry process, and 2 is enough for 3 to 6, but I'm sure how much is necessary to work will vary clay deposit to clay deposit. It's important to boil the flour for the trick to work. I found just flour on its own won't work. It doesn't need to be boiled for long, normally just 30 seconds or so, just long enough that the flour makes a steady suspension that won't settle. After making my starch water, I just add a bit of vinegar and use the combination to hydrate my clay powder. Vinegar helps prevent the flour from fermenting the clay and becoming gross smelling. I've also found that it can make the clay more plastic itself. In some side-by-side tests, I found that clay powder hydrated with some vinegar will be somewhat more plastic than clay powder in plain water. Clay hydrated with starch gel and no vinegar will be substantially more plastic than both the plain clay and the vinegar clay, but will over the course of a few days begin to smell horrible, which I'm sure is a result of iron-oxidizing bacteria in the clay producing swamp gases, along with other microbes feasting on the flour. Clay made with both the starch gel and the vinegar is around the same plasticity as the clay with just starch gel, but won't smell too bad. Once the mixture is added in, I just hydrate the clay the rest of the way with regular water and let it soak in and firm up. After a day or two to harden up and a bit of kneading to distribute moisture, the clay is ready to go and can be made into whatever you please. If you want some good techniques for building pottery, I can't recommend Andy Word's channel enough. Along with this, the Potted History channel is also phenomenal and has a lot of informative videos about all sorts of tried and tested techniques from across history. With that, I'm going to end this video here. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, it won't be too long before I have a video up about what it is I'm making with this clay, and I have some other stuff in the works I'm excited for. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you've got questions or comments, please feel free to comment below. Thanks again, and bye!